We did work with a sort of shorthand version of if we're 80% sure that we know what we're dealing with, we're going to move first and then adjudicate after it's been done. And by and large, that worked out very well during the height of the war on terror. And there was an urgency that I think needs to be felt now as we think about targeting Russian assets too.
Move first, adjudicate later. And he advises us to mirror actions used during the war on terror. You know, when I think of lessons learned from the war on terror, it's pretty much always a list of things not to do.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 284th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And I bring you an episode today knowing that it might not be the episode you want to hear right now. I know a lot is happening in the world, and if you follow me on Twitter, you know that I have been almost obsessively following the news out of Israel and Gaza, like much of the rest of the world. Because after the horrific and totally unjustified terrorist attack carried out against innocent civilians on October 7th in Israel by Hamas, who are the thugs that sort of govern the tiny Gaza Strip after being elected 17 years ago and then canceling all future elections. Well, after the Hamas terrorist attack, Israel has been relentlessly bombing the 2 million residents of the Gaza Strip, half of whom are children, a population that is being prevented from leaving. And as of this recording, over 9,000 people, the vast majority of whom had nothing to do with the terrorist attack, have been killed by Israel, a country that has been funded and armed by the United States. And in Congress, support for Israel, for better or worse, right now seems damn near uncontroversial. The question in our Congress is not whether or not we will send billions of additional dollars in weapons to Israel, but when and what will be attached to the bill that does so. There have been protests all over the country demanding that the Biden administration use our country's leverage to pressure Israel to stop the bombing. And as of this recording, the Biden administration is simply refusing to do so, instead saying that the people of Gaza should be given access to food, water, and medicine, which they should. But as for the bombs, I don't know, duck and cover? The situation is quite frankly the most horrific thing I've witnessed in my entire life. And if you're as horrified and angry as I am, I hope you're calling your members of Congress daily, because I have been. But the Israeli bombardment of Gaza has been the main topic on every cable news station for weeks, both domestically and internationally. The media spotlight is shining bright on the Israel-Gaza situation. And at this time, while there are multiple ideas being discussed in Congress, there are no serious bills yet written. Now, I do have to say, the House of Representatives has passed one bill that had $14 billion for Israel in it, but it won't pass the Senate, and President Biden has promised to veto it because it defunds the IRS and makes our national debt even worse, according to the Congressional Budget Office. And so, since there are no serious bills yet written, I don't think I have anything useful to add to that conversation right now as the host of Congressional Dish. What I promise to do is to let you know exactly what becomes law. I will read every word, and I will let you know exactly how much blood this Congress spreads all over our hands. Because the nature of Congressional Dish is that I don't break news. I'm never first with these stories, but I'm often the most thorough. And so please be patient. I will get to this topic, even though it's complicated and scary to talk about. But I do have to admit that I am ashamed that I've avoided talking about Israel and the land that should be Palestine for all these years. But I'm done being scared of the backlash. My money, my taxes, they don't fund Hamas. They fund Israel. And we need to know what Israel plans to do with it. But today, while the spotlight is shining almost exclusively on Israel, and you can easily get information about it, I want to make you aware of a conversation that is happening not only in our Congress, but among our international allies, which could have serious long-term implications for the structure of global governing. Today, I'm going to share with you the highlights of an off-the-radar discussion happening about Russia and Ukraine. Specifically, how to fund the ongoing proxy war we're having with Russia over territory in Ukraine. Now, I've done multiple episodes going over the situation in Ukraine dating back to 2014, which is when this war really first started. And so I highly recommend listening to Congressional Dish 244 called Keeping Ukraine, which I produced in December of 2021, a few months before the full-blown invasion of Ukraine. That episode is going to give you the full backstory on how our government, during the Obama-Biden administration, and under the command of then Vice President Joe Biden in particular, helped orchestrate a regime change in Ukraine in early 2014, which they orchestrated right after the former president of Ukraine decided at the last minute to partner Ukraine economically with Russia instead of the European Union. Ukraine is blessed and cursed with fertile agricultural land, lots of untapped fossil fuel resources, and it's a transportation hub for fossil fuels between Russia and Europe. And the multinational corporations for which our government serves want access to all of that. And so I'm not going to retell that history again today. In this episode, I'm going to assume you have already listened to at least Congressional Dish 244, but there are more episodes about this going back 9 years if you want to fully jump down the rabbit hole. But I'm going to assume you have at least listened to 244 and already know the backstory on Ukraine. And assuming that you have paused this episode and have just returned from doing your homework, you now know that the Ukraine war is now and always has been an economic war. And that's not just my dumbass assessment. Here's Philip Zelikow, who is currently a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and White Burkett Miller Professor of History at the University of Virginia. But he is not just some professor. Philip Zelikow was on the National Security Council staff during the presidency of George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1991. He was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, and he served as State Department lawyer from 2005 to 2007 during the George W. Bush administration. And he was invited to testify to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs after co-writing an article in Foreign Affairs, which is the magazine for global elites published by and for the Council on Foreign Relations, about how to pay for the war and reconstruction of Ukraine. This testimony is from October 8th in the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
Point 1. Economic warfare is the real center of gravity in this war. Economic warfare is the center of gravity in the war. I know we all watch the daily updates from the battle front lines. You know, this movement here, that movement there. This is a war of attrition. It's going to be decided by economic and industrial staying power as the war continues almost certainly into 2025 and perhaps beyond.
And we United States taxpayers and the taxpayers of Europe have invested a lot of our tax money into this economic and physical war effort. Here's Secretary of State Antony Blinken testifying to the Senate Appropriations Committee on Halloween.
If you look at it, total assistance to Ukraine going back to February of 2022, the United States has provided about $75 billion, our allies and partners, $90 billion. If you look at budget support, the United States has provided about $22 billion during that period, allies and partners, $49 billion during that period. Military support, we provided about $43 billion, allies and partners, $33 billion. Humanitarian assistance, the United States, $2.3 billion, allies and partners, $4.5 billion, plus another 18 to 20 billion in caring for the many refugees who went to Europe and outside of Ukraine.
Adding all of that up, the United States taxpayers have paid about $142 billion in the last year and a half for the Ukraine war effort, and everyone else combined has paid about $196 billion. And Secretary of State Blinken was asking the Appropriations Committee for over $60 billion more from us. And that's 4 times the funding they were requesting for Israel. The Biden administration's main foreign war priority remains the war in Ukraine. And so here's the situation as of mid-October 2023, according to Philip Zelikow, who is the trusted advisor of the Bush presidencies and the Council on Foreign Relations.
In that struggle, the economic warfare against Russia has achieved some gains and will have some more gains over the long haul. Russia's economic warfare against Ukraine has been devastating and is not sufficiently appreciated. Ukraine lost 30% of its GDP in the first year of the war. 1/3 of the population of Ukraine is displaced, half externally, half internally. Russia is waging economic warfare on three main fronts. It's destroying Ukraine's infrastructure and will do another energy infrastructure war this winter, for which it's gearing up, including with North Korean weapons and Iranian weapons. Point two, they've destroyed Ukraine's ability to export through the Black Sea, except for a trickle, which was the fundamental business model of a commodity exporting country. Point three, they have destroyed Ukraine's civil aviation. Ukraine has no civil aviation. Any of you who have traveled as I have to Ukraine will notice that you can't fly in the country, which makes travel and business in the country now back to the era of the railroads before there were airplanes. So the Russian economic warfare against Ukraine is devastating, and as time passes, this is going to have deep effects on the ability of Ukraine's economy and society to hold together, which will play out politically. So point one, economic warfare is the true center of gravity in the war.
Which doesn't exactly jive with the propaganda that we've been fed saying that Ukraine is winning the war. And maps don't jive with that bullshit either. Because while Secretary Blinken keeps saying, as he did on Twitter as I was working on this episode, that, quote, Ukraine has reclaimed more than half the territory Russia seized since 2022, unquote, he fails to mention that almost all of that progress happened in 2022. The map hasn't really changed at all for the last year, even after Ukraine's counteroffensive. And I, of course, have proof of all of this in the show notes for you. And so Ukraine is not winning the war right now. And as winter quickly approaches, it's become quite clear to anyone who's being honest that it's a stalemate. And so here's what Zelikow proposed in his Foreign Affairs article, which I read back in June, and which inspired members of Congress so much that they invited him to testify to the wisdom of his ideas.
The Russian assets are the key strategy to change the outcome. The Russian assets are key. The Russian assets are at least $280 billion. $280 billion. Now, even in our debased day and age, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money in the context of the Ukrainian economy. Even using very conservative multipliers of how much private investment the public investment can unlock, let's say 1-to-1, the impact of this money on the whole future prospects of Ukraine and its staying power are decisive. Otherwise, they're relying on U.S. and European taxpayers whose readiness you can gauge. So this is potentially the decisive fulcrum of the economic warfare and Ukraine's prospects in the war.
In other words, he's advocating for taking Russia's money and using it in Ukraine.
The whole argument that I made in an article with Summers and Zellick in Foreign Affairs is that actually this is a strategy for victory. You put this enormous war chest and the multiplier of private investment into play. And what you can envision is a whole new European recovery program anchored on the rebuilding of Ukraine that not only saves Ukraine, revitalizes it, but links it to the EU accession process, to the enlargement of the European Union, and in other words, to the victory of the whole cause of freedom in a way almost regardless of where the final battle line ends up being in Ukraine. Ukraine will be growing with bright prospects, part of a Europe with brighter prospects because of its alignment with the free world.
And here's more of their sunshine and rainbows vision for what the Russian money would be used for. Here's Representative Thomas Keene Jr. of New Jersey speaking with Philip Zelikow.
If the United States did transfer Russian sovereign assets to Ukraine, how could Ukraine best use these in the near term?
In the near term, what they would do, I think, is begin undertaking a comprehensive program to shore up their infrastructure, withstand the coming Russian campaigns to further damage that, and begin to rebuild the basic transportation infrastructure and other things that can then begin to unlock a really bright future for the rest of the Ukrainian economy. There are things that can be done then to move Ukrainian industry into new sectors, because I think the Ukrainian goal is not just to restore what they had 5 years ago, but actually to use this as a way to build back better, to imagine a brighter future in partnership with Europe. And then if the money is managed well, the leverage this gives to encourage the Ukrainian reform process as part of EU accession then makes Putin's whole effort here is, if I can't conquer Ukraine, I will wreck it and make it ungovernable. And we'll show decisively that that objective cannot be achieved.
Even though his own testimony earlier showed that in reality, it is being achieved. And it seems a little weird to talk about rebuilding a country that is still currently very much still at war with a nuclear power. Like, what's the point of investing in building roads that can just be rebombed? Don't we need to end the war first? But that's actually kind of beside the point here. The point is, regardless of how they want to use it, our Congress is discussing essentially stealing another country's money, which that country has in multinational banks, and using it however they see fit. And this has moved beyond the conversation stage. There are bills already written to start the steal. Here's Representative Michael McCall of Texas, who is the Republican chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
The Russian sovereign assets is a winner, in my judgment. If we can tap into the very people who started this war and this conflict, in my judgment, should be paying for the cost and not as much the U.S. taxpayer. And that's why I introduced the Repo Act, the bipartisan, bicameral legislation that demands that the Biden administration transfer frozen Russian sovereign assets to the Ukraine effort. It's beyond time that Russia pay for the war that it created. My bill prohibits the Biden administration from unfreezing Russian sovereign assets until Russia ends its unprovoked war of aggression and agrees to compensate Ukraine for the damages it has inflicted.
So that's one proposal, to use the Russian money as leverage to stop the war and refuse to give all of it back because part of the settlement to end the war would be compensation for Ukraine. But there are other bills, including versions of the Repo Act, that are more extreme. Here's Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, a Democrat, a member of the other party, talking about his version of the bill with the same name as McCall's, the Repo Act. And he's speaking the day after the House hearing on October 19th during a meeting of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the Helsinki Commission.
Along with Ranking Member Risch, I'm the lead on what we call the Repo Act, which would authorize the president to work with other countries in Europe that are also home to frozen Russian sovereign assets and create a procedure for seizing those assets and directing them to Ukraine to be used for rebuilding and other purposes. There's, I think, mixed feelings in the administration about this, but they seem to be moving our way. And I'd love to have your thoughts on the value of grabbing those sovereign assets, not just as additional resources for Ukraine, but also as a powerful signal to Putin that his behavior is going to have real punishment. And hitting him good and hard right in the wallet, I think, would be a good added signal.
What he's advocating for is straight up stealing. And there's yet another bill floating around the House that more closely matches Sheldon Whitehouse's idea. Here's Representative French Hill of Arkansas, a Republican.
I, too, have introduced a bill on this topic, H.R. 5370, and I appreciate the Foreign Affairs staff working with me on that. My bill would give the president authority to seize and transfer title of Russian sovereign assets within the United States jurisdiction into an international fund for the sole purpose of Ukraine's eventual reconstruction and humanitarian relief. I want to be grateful. I'm grateful to Chairman McCall, and I co-sponsor his bill on this topic as well for his leadership. And further, let me be clear. I consider Russian Federation sovereign assets inclusive of all state-owned enterprise assets and those of Russian publicly traded companies like Gazprom that are controlled by more than 50% by the Russian Federation.
And so that's not just stealing Russian government money in the banks, but also the money held by Russian government companies, which are not entirely owned by Russia. There's some private sector ownership mixed in there too. But in order to pull this off, we're going to need accomplices.
Considering most Russian sovereign assets are actually located outside the United States, it's important for our partners and allies around the world to introduce and pass similar companion legislation rather than having the U.S. act unilaterally.
And to make this clear theft legal-ish, here's how Hill's bill, which is supported by the committee chairman, would do it.
My approach was crafted to be consistent with U.S. policy and international law by amending the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, and using its established framework and existing definitions. As a former Treasury official, in my view, this is a better legislative approach.
So hearing that from him, his idea seems to match the approach argued for by lawyer and frequent congressional witness Lawrence Tribe. His approach was published first in 2022 in the New York Times and then expanded upon on the Lawfare website, in which he says that President Biden should take the money that the Russian central bank has in the United States, which has been frozen there for years due to Treasury enacting sanctions that ban banks from completing any transactions with Russia's central bank. Well, he points to a section of current law created by what Hill said, the International Economic Powers Act, in 1977, which was a law intended to limit presidential emergency powers. But that law says that the president can essentially prohibit the transfer of property belonging to a foreign country after a declaration of an emergency. And an emergency was declared by the Biden administration on April 15th, 2021, which, I must note, was 10 months before the Russian invasion. But Lawrence Tribe, in his articles, says that this has actually been done before. So the example he cites are that in 2003, George W. Bush froze about $1.7 billion in Iraqi government funds that were deposited in American banks. He then says in 2012, the Obama administration allowed Iranian central bank money deposited in U.S. banks to be used to pay settlements to families whose loved ones were killed in Iranian terror attacks. But I do have to note that that is currently being evaluated as possibly illegal in the International Court of Justice. And then in 2019, President Trump turned over some Venezuelan central bank deposits over to the puppet that they tried and failed to install as Venezuelan President, Juan Guaido. And then last year in 2022, President Biden diverted about $7 billion in Afghanistan government funds to families of 9/11 victims and to so-called humanitarian groups of the Biden administration's choosing, instead of returning that money to the Taliban, who, whether we like it or not, is the rightful government of Afghanistan, a country we are no longer at war with. And so this is a form of international lawlessness that started, like so many instances of modern-day lawlessness, with the George W. Bush administration, and has been dabbled with by every administration since. But this proposal would take it to a whole new level by not just freezing, but taking all of Russia's central bank's money that is frozen in multinational World Trade System banks and transferring ownership to someone else. You know, this idea may have been test-driven in the past, but transferring ownership of hundreds of billions of dollars is Formula One, let's fucking go level money jacking. And Tribe says it's legal because the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment to be exact, only protects government seizure of property belonging to persons, which he says doesn't include foreign governments. But my research indicates that that is a controversial position and not settled law. And there are cases in which a foreign government has been defined as a person and successfully gained protection under U.S. law. But no matter what, this idea that's also being floated around in Congress, even by Tribe's reasoning, you can't spin this part of the plan into being legal. You just can't. Here's Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island.
The second is simply to make sure that we do a better job of grabbing Russian oligarch assets. We have a predicament right now, which is that if you're a U.S. citizen and you're driving down the highway and you've got $400,000 in unexplained cash in your car, the police can pull you over and they can seize that. If you are a foreign Russian crooked oligarch and you have a $400 million yacht someplace, you have more rights than that American citizen in terms of defending your yacht. It's a very simple procedure. It's called in rem. You move on the yacht rather than having to chase through all the ownership structures. And I would very much like to see us pass a bill that allows us to proceed against foreign oligarchs, criminals, and kleptocrats' assets in rem.
And so instead of making it as illegal to take Americans' cash as it is to take rich foreigners' boats, the senator is proposing we make it easier to steal the boats of rich foreigners. You know, for a guy from the Democratic Party, which brands itself as the party of democracy, these are some real authoritarian ideas. Because I didn't hear a single word about a trial, did you? You know, whether you support the Ukraine war or not, taking anyone's money without due process, without a judge, without a jury, doesn't that go against everything we say we stand for in the United States? You know, just listen to this advice to Congress that wasn't laughed out of the room. Here's Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. I don't know, but he's currently the senior vice president at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, who used to be a counterterrorism analyst at the U.S. Department of the Treasury during the second half of the George W. Bush administration. And this was his response to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's idea about taking the assets of rich foreigners.
As far as targeting the oligarch assets, I fully understand your frustration. When I worked at the Treasury Department, trying to track those kinds of assets was never easy. We did work with a sort of shorthand version of if we're 80% sure that we know what we're dealing with, we're going to move first and then adjudicate after it's been done. And by and large, that worked out very well during the height of the war on terror, and there was an urgency that I think needs to be felt now as we think about targeting Russian assets too.
Move first, adjudicate later. And he advises us to mirror actions used during the war on terror. You know, when I think of lessons learned from the war on terror, it's pretty much always a list of things not to do. But in Congress, they're taking notes on how to use war on terror precedents to operate lawlessly now. I mean, that quote, move first and adjudicate later, that was received by our Congress with nods, no pushback at all. And with this idea, again, they are looking for accomplices. Here's Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Jonathan Schanzer.
To follow down my path of in rem Latinate legal terms, there's also qui tam out there, which allows individuals to bring fraud actions in the name of the United States, and if it turns out there really is fraud, they get a share of it. And it would be nice to have people who work for, let's say, a Russian oligarch to be able to be paid a bit of a bounty if they come in and testify and say, yep, definitely his boat. Every time we go out, he's on it. Every time the guests come, they're his guests, and we call him boss. Things like that can make a big difference. So we're trying to push that as well.
That sounds like something for the Rewards for Justice program at the State Department. They might be able to expand it. We already have bounties for those that provide evidence leading to arrests of terrorists. Why not oligarchs?
Correct.
The Rewards for Justice program, which until this moment I did not know was a thing, is being proposed to be used to steal the assets of rich foreigners, tried and convicted of no crimes. And I just want to be clear, as you hear me saying this, I'm not saying that I give a single about Russian oligarchs, but I do care about justice. I do care about private property rights meaning something in this world. I do care and do fear the idea that our government might be in the process of giving itself the power to take an individual's belongings based solely upon the accusations of paid snitches. And Congress is being told that to do some of this stuff, no new laws are even required. Here's Representative Ted Lieu, Democrat of California, speaking to Philip Zelikow.
You believe the administration, even without this bill, has authority right now to transfer the frozen Russian assets to Ukraine?
Yes, it does. It has it under the existing IEPA authorities that the president has already invoked. And the Renewed Democracy Initiative has put out a really extensive legal brief that goes into great detail about this. And I think actually the administration's lawyers are coming around to the view that, yes, they do have the authority under existing law. What the REPO Act does is, one, it reaffirms that, but two, it makes Congress a partner in this, with regulation and oversight that's an appropriate congressional role. So by both reaffirming the authority and getting Congress to join the executive in doing this together, I think it makes it a truly national effort with an appropriate congressional part.
But a key player in the Biden administration does not appear on board with this idea. Here's Representative Michael McCall of Texas speaking to Philip Zelikow.
Our Treasury Secretary, Ms. Yellen, recently claimed that transferring sovereign assets to Ukraine was not legal. Do you agree with that? And if not, what is your opinion from a legal standpoint?
I think Secretary Yellen has now revised her view of this matter, having had a chance to be informed by some of the legal work that's been done since she first made that impromptu remark. There is the legal authority both under domestic law and international law, and the bill this committee is considering would both reaffirm and consolidate and elaborate that authority. So legally, this can be done.
But I don't think he accurately represented Treasury Secretary Yellen's position when he gave that testimony to Congress on the 18th. What I found, as reported by the Wall Street Journal on October 11th, is that Secretary Yellen supports taking the interest that the banks would pay Russia on the money that they've frozen. But she still doesn't seem to think it's legal to take the money that Russia actually owns. And one of the reasons why that Russian money is legally untouchable, at least according to some lawyers, is because of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which is a law that was signed in 1976 that provides unlimited protection to the assets of foreign central banks parked in the United States, which does include assets of foreign central banks who do bad things like invade their neighbors. Now, the reason for that immunity should be obvious. U.S. banks, in particular the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, they want to attract depositors. And the only way that depositors will trust our banking system is if they have legal protection from having their deposits confiscated. But here's what Philip Zelikow, the servant of the President's Bush, is telling Congress about sovereign immunity.
What about sovereign immunity? But sovereign immunity is a doctrine that only exists in the context of national courts trying to usurp sovereign authority. In a situation where it's sovereign on sovereign, whereas in this bill there would be an act of state that goes after Russian sovereign property, there is no such thing as immunity. There is no doctrine of sovereign immunity. Ordinarily, under international law, if one sovereign takes another sovereign's property, then the loser is entitled to compensation for that nationalization or expropriation. So why isn't Russia entitled for that compensation in this case? Because it's a lawful state countermeasure. Countermeasures are different from sanctions. And countermeasures, and this is a well-recognized body of law, you are allowed to do things that would ordinarily violate your sovereign obligations to a fellow sovereign because that sovereign has committed such extreme outlaw behavior that the countermeasure is a lawful recourse. And that is exactly the extreme case we have here. There's a well-codified body of law on this, and Russia has hit every one of the marks for a set of lawful state countermeasures that deprives them of any right to compensation when states take their money and then use it, putting it in escrow to compensate the victims of Russia's aggression.
So basically, the idea is that because Russia did something very, very bad, we can do something that would otherwise be illegal in order to counter the bad. But where's the judge and jury in this process? This sounds like a recipe for lawlessness to me, and I'm not alone. On the Lawfare website, I found a back and forth going back many months about the legality of all this, and Zelikow's ideas were repeatedly refuted by a law professor named Paul Steffen. Paul Steffen is a professor of law at the University of Virginia School of Law. He served as a counselor on international law to the legal advisor at the U.S. Department of State during 2006 and 2007 during the George W. Bush administration, and he served as a special counsel to the General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Defense in 2020 and 2021 during the Trump administration. So this man is not exactly a hippie. And Professor Paul Steffen was not invited to testify, nor was anyone else who disagreed with the idea that stealing Russia's central bank's money is legal. But on the Lawfare website, Professor Steffen minced no words about the ideas presented in this hearing, naming witness Philip Zelikow specifically as one of the people he says, quote, gets current law wrong, unquote. Professor Steffen argues that current law clearly authorizes the freezing of assets, but that freezing does not change ownership, and that the only time the law authorizes the taking of foreign assets is when, quote, the United States is engaged in armed hostilities or has been attacked by a foreign country, unquote. And Russia has not attacked the United States. And in response to the idea that you just heard presented to Congress, the idea that countermeasures are legal because Russia's invasion was so illegal, well, Professor Stephan says, quote, "It is simply not true that even grave violations of international law permit the rest of the world to retaliate with any measure that otherwise would violate international law," unquote. But even this professor is not actually against the idea of the assets being taken from Russia and given to Ukraine. He thinks, quote, "Transfer of title in these assets to an international body with authority to adjudicate claims provides a compelling response under international law to any Russian demands," unquote. And so basically, he supports transferring Russia's money to Ukraine, but he says that some kind of international court system needs to be at the center of the transfer. There needs to be some kind of judicial system involved. And the bills being kicked around in Congress, he says, don't do that. He says, quote, "The Repo Act has serious flaws. It gives the Secretary of State a blank check as to how to use confiscated Russian assets," unquote. And he warns that there's a section in the bill that, quote, "aspires to bar judicial review of any constitutional claims raised by sovereign actors against confiscation," unquote. And so basically, the bills moving through Congress facilitate lawlessness, the taking of assets with no justice system involvement. And I agree with Professor Stephan that that's a problem. And it would also be a wasted opportunity for peace. And as someone who does care about Ukrainian civilians and wants them to stop dying and wants them to be able to go back to living normal lives in their homes, peace is always the goal for me. And Professor Stephan says, quote, "Premature disbursement of the funds obtained from Russia, rather than reserving them to fund reconstruction through an internationally legitimate process, would thwart what we would consider the best hope for bringing the war to a tolerable, if not necessarily satisfying conclusion: the establishment of an international tribunal controlling these funds with the power to adjudicate all claims to reparations. We argue that a transfer of funds from forfeited assets to such a tribunal would survive challenges under international law, and thus would not give Russia a plausible claim to impede settlement negotiations," unquote. And even Philip Zelikow in the House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing had to acknowledge that the Russian money could be used for leverage in peace negotiations.
I think the point you raised a minute ago about, do we want to hold this back as leverage, was one factor in the back of the minds of some people. I think as the war has continued on through this year, I think hopes of a quick settlement of the war somehow have dissipated. I think they realize that they're in it for, this is going to be a long war. Everyone that sobering realization has kind of sunk in. And also, from a legal point of view, if you want to, you could credit the Russians in any peace negotiation. You basically say this is a credit against your liability for rebuilding Ukraine.
But that only works if the money isn't straight up taken by the United States and our partners. Because if Russia figures that the West plans to treat it as a defeated power no matter what happens at the negotiating table, Russia will have fewer reasons to make a deal. And so not only is it very unclear that this idea of taking the assets of Russia's government and rich citizens and handing them to Ukraine, not only is it very unclear that it is now or could ever be actually legal, but it's also likely that doing so would make it harder to end the war, to make it possible for Ukrainians to be safe in their homes. And it's clear that other countries are struggling with the legality and wisdom of this idea as well. Here's Philip Zelikow.
What the EU came up with in May was the idea, they were encountering a lot of resistance to actually taking the Russian money. So since they said, well, can we come up with something, since a lot of these securities have now matured and are in cash, and Euroclear, mainly, the clearinghouse in Brussels, is now managing the cash on behalf of Russia can't manage it because Russia is no longer able to manage it. So can we do something with the interest? And that, by the way, the EU couldn't get that through in June. Ursula von der Leyen couldn't get that adopted over principally French and German opposition at the time. So they're talking about just taking this interest. As a legal matter, if you have the legal right to take the interest, you have the legal right to take the principal. This was a cosmetic idea trying to overcome the opposition they had there. it's kind of a situation where, as one of my colleagues in this effort, Larry Tribe, has put it, is, well, instead of crossing the Rubicon, they're kind of wading in. From a legal point of view, it's actually clearer to do the transfer for Ukraine than to try to expropriate the money using tax authorities, which makes it look like you're expropriating it for your country rather than for the benefit of the victims, which is a much cleaner legal way to do it. They ended up, for political reasons, with a half measure that takes only a tiny fraction of what they should and does so in ways that are actually legally awkward. I understand why they are where they are, but as they process this, I think they're just going to have to step up to going ahead and crossing the Rubicon.
And he's advising Congress to give him a push.
The U.S. only holds a fraction of the relevant Russian money, because the Russians tried to get their money out of our jurisdiction. But when you go to Europe and ask them what's holding them up, they all say we're waiting for the American lead. So even though we may only hold a fraction of the money, we hold a lot more than a fraction of the relevant clout. But we need to go together, exactly as you imply.
And they want us to go together quickly because of the threat of democracy getting in their way. Here's Representative Madeline Dean of Pennsylvania speaking to Philip Zelikow.
As a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, we have been to many European nations, to a nation. They say the United States is the indispensable partner here, and they say that with all humility, not blowing smoke. We visited The Hague and sat with lead prosecutor Khan, and everyone is talking about waiting us out, not just waiting out Congress's support, but waiting out the outcome of the next election. They asked us specifically about that. Mr. Putin is clearly waiting for the outcome of the next election in hopes that it will not be re-election of Joe Biden, who has, I'm really proud, and there he is in Israel right now. Timing. How does this work? And how do we make sure, you already said it's going to be into 2025. How do we use this leverage, this economic warfare, as the center of gravity in this conflict to bring the timing tighter to a successful conclusion for Ukraine?
So that's a great question. And this is why action on this issue is so urgent now. Because the operational timeline to stand this up on a massive multi-hundred billion dollar scale is if we move on this in the next couple of months and mobilize the money, we could get an enormous operation up and running with a relatively secure source of funding by next year. If we get that up and running by the middle of next year, we then insulate ourselves to some extent against the kind of electoral risk to which you gently alluded.
So, to sum up the situation, the Treasury Secretary in the Biden administration is at the very least hesitant to steal Russia's assets and give them to Ukraine. The European Union is hesitant to steal Russia's assets and give them to Ukraine. They seem concerned that the American people are hesitant to steal Russia's assets and give them to Ukraine, because we might dare to elect someone who would not be on board with that plan. And it turns out that the bankers are also hesitant to steal Russia's assets and give them to Ukraine.
There was a knee-jerk neuralgia on the part of bankers and financiers to the actual confiscation of Russian assets in the foreign exchange holdings, with much talk of losing confidence in the dollar and the euro. On analysis, these worries quickly fall away, which is one reason that I worked with my colleagues Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, and Bob Zoellick, the former president of the World Bank, who do know something about international finance, to debunk those concerns. And I'd be glad to go into more detail about why the concerns about the dollar or the euro turn out to be overblown when they're analyzed.
Go on.
Is when people worry about the significance of this in foreign exchange, I ask them to just remember two numbers, 93 and 3. 93 and 3. If you look at the percentage of foreign exchange holdings held in the world today, 60% United States, 23% euro, 6 yen, 4 sterling. That's 93. Percentage of foreign exchange holdings in Chinese renminbi, 3. And the Chinese are really encouraged that it's gone up from 2.5 to 3 in recent years. So when you look at 93-3, that's what you get when we work with our allies in a concerted economic strategy. We can move on the Russian assets, and there's really no choice except to stick with the currencies of the free world because they're still the only basis for being a participant in the world economy.
You know, we recently produced an episode in June. It was episode 276, and I called it The Demise of Dollar Dominance. And in that episode, we heard that what he just said is largely true. The U.S. dollar, we're not talking about the euro or any of those, the U.S. dollar is used in about 88% of all foreign exchange transactions. And 59% of all foreign exchange reserves are held in U.S. dollars. But that number is falling. It was over 70% in 2001. And even though other countries aren't trading much in other currencies right now, we know that they are setting up the financial infrastructure needed to do so, with China and Russia taking the lead. And China in particular is not a small economy. And China has also been buying a lot of gold, which we heard witnesses testify to their concerns about in that episode. You know, there's a lot of focus on currencies and which ones are being used for trade, but trades could be conducted using gold. Our own dollar was pegged to gold once upon a time, and now it's pegged to nothing. And with our debt getting larger and larger, and with our Congress being run by lunatics, the world is watching all of this. And if we take all of Russia's money with no judicial system involvement, how do we expect the rest of the world to trust us? If we are behaving lawlessly and justify it by saying, "Fuck you, you have nowhere else to go." What the rest of the world will do is they will create somewhere else to go. And this argument that this guy is making, this is just arrogance. And the arrogance being displayed within Congress, with them inviting this kind of testimony with no counter arguments welcome in the room. I mean, just listen to this.
Whenever you do a large thing in international affairs, there are going to be unintended consequences from that. And rather than just sort of say, oh, be dismissive about that concern, I'll say if you embark on this, then people will be tempted to try to use these sorts of precedents against us. They'll be limited in their ability to do that because of the fundamental places where money is held in the world economy. A lot of people don't do business with the United States because they love us. They do business with us because they think it's necessary. If they could expropriate our property with no penalty, they would. Venezuela tried that. Most of the world doesn't want to follow Venezuela's example. So yes, there are some potential unintended consequences of people trying to use this or use this precedent. But one reason we've tried to set this under international law is let's use the standards of international law to govern this countermeasure. International law allows these countermeasures, but it says you can only do this if the target country's outlaw behavior is extreme. And there's a standard for that. It turns out Russia totally meets that standard. This is the most extreme case of international aggression since the Second World War, bigger than Korea, bigger than Kuwait. But by setting that kind of standard, it makes that slippery slope a little less slippery.
Does it, though? Because without some kind of judicial system involved in this, what you're saying is that Russia meets the standard because we say so. And that's enough? Our Congress was told that it was. But Professor Stephan, had he or anyone else with similar views been invited into the debate, well, he would have told Congress, quote, U.S. policymakers should not be comfortable about flouting international law, even if the law produces a result they find repugnant. Since the end of the Cold War, U.S. foreign policy has presented the international rule of law as one of the linchpins of the global society that the U.S. wants to build. Granted, the United States' principal adversaries, China and Russia, have a different conception as to what international rule of law means. But a transparent violation of a category of rules that the U.S. normally supports, simply because compliance would frustrate an immediate sense of justice, undermines the ability to use international law to shape a more peaceful and prosperous world for those in the United States, as well as the other residents on this planet, unquote. That's an important perspective. And I'm deeply disturbed that in this hearing, and the other hearing, actually, in both the House and the Senate, that perspective wasn't welcome or wanted. This Congress didn't want to hear it. The idea that we can and should steal Russia's money was bipartisan, and bills have been written to facilitate it in the House and the Senate. And as I sit here today, I am just overwhelmed by all the lawlessness. in war, in economics, lawlessness. Everywhere I look, lawlessness, and with bipartisan support. And this really isn't about Russia. I mean, it is, but it's bigger than that. We're talking about the power to take ownership of assets away from other governments and private individuals. And that's not one that I want granted to the Secretary of State. Even if you trust Antony Blinken, which I definitely don't, but even if you do, will you want that power given to Secretary of State Eric Trump? You know, the target is Russians today, but power granted can and will be wielded in unpredictable ways. This is something that needs to be carefully considered and debated, and the American people should be a part of this debate. But these hearings about these ideas and these bills were not aired on television, they weren't on C-SPAN, and there was hardly anyone in these hearing rooms. While the world watches our ally bomb nonstop a caged population, starved of food and water and electricity and medicine, starved of all of life's essentials, as the world watches and protests a lawless government that is being funded and armed with our money and our weapons, granting the power to steal the assets of foreign countries and private individuals with no legal process is being debated in the United States in the shadows. And so I'm shining some light on it today. And that's all we can really do right now. You know, the feeling of powerlessness in the midst of all this lawlessness, it's really overwhelming lately. But together, I still believe we aren't powerless. And individually, you can let your member of Congress know that you see what they're up to. And you can shine light on this power expansion to the executive branch by sharing this episode. Because every new listener is more light. Every new listener is one more person who might call their member of Congress and spook them a little on the eve of an election year. If shining light is all we can do, well, let's at least do that. Because the only thing that feels worse than knowing your country is slipping further and further towards unconscionable lawlessness is knowing you did nothing to stop it. So please share the show and call Congress. Because right now, I don't know what else to do. I say this a lot, but I'm really grateful for the business model and your participation in it right now, because I'm aware that I haven't even done an episode on Israel yet. And just what I said in this episode is going to be enough for people to fire me. I am aware of it. Israel is a very heated topic, but I can't stay silent about it anymore. Not after what I witnessed. I really do feel ashamed because after 2014, Israel did a lot of bombing of Gaza, which is a very, very small piece of land. It's unbelievable to me how small it is. I was looking at a map of it again today. My fat ass can get across all of Gaza in an hour on my feet, the short way. And it would take me under 6 hours to do it the long way. This is not a big piece of land to be dropping that many bombs on. And in 2014, they dropped a lot of bombs and killed a lot of people. And I was doing the show at the time, and I just stayed out of it. I shouldn't have done that. And I'm not going to make that mistake again. Because, you know, we can condemn Hamas all day. But the fact of the matter is, we're not funding them. We're funding the Israeli side. And those bombs that are dropping on the heads of all of those people, not just, I mean, we all focus on the children, as we should. So many children have died, but I think men and women matter too. 9,000 of them, you guys. 9,000. And I actually know it's more than that now. I just haven't looked up the exact number today because I can't handle it. Before I went on the air today, one of the reasons I'm so upset about this is that I was watching a report from the ground. There are journalists. Al Jazeera English had reporters in Gaza before October 7th, before the borders of Gaza were completely shut down. So they have people who are reporting from inside Gaza. And I was watching their report because a convoy of ambulances, which the Red Cross had been informed would be leaving at 4 p.m. local time and driving south, as they have been told to do, to go to the border so that these injured people could get into Egypt and get the care that they need. There was a line of ambulances, and Israel bombed them. And as I am watching that report, they broke into that report to report on a hospital being bombed. And this isn't, rumors on a blog. It was an actual news report. And so that's what happened right before I went on the air today. And it's been day after day after day of just horrific news and horrific pictures. And yeah, I can't stay silent about it anymore. And I can't stay silent about it either because our government's going to send them more money and weapons. And so we have to know exactly what's in that bill, because I don't know if you saw it on the Congressional Dish story, which you should be following. So Claire's my assistant. She's amazing. And she's in charge of the Congressional Dish Twitter and Instagram account. And so I follow it on Instagram. And she found an article today that was talking about the Biden administration's proposal for Israel. And they want at least $3.5 billion of the Israel money to basically be a black box. They want to make an exemption that would essentially allow the Biden administration to spend that money how they want to and not have to report what they do with it to Congress, which, according to this article that was from Truth Out, that's completely unprecedented. I know I've never seen anything like that before. And so we have to know exactly what becomes law. So I have to do this episode whether I like it or not. This is just a really, really messed up time. And there is no way to speak about these issues and not piss people off. So, as has happened many times in the Congressional Dish history, I am going to get fired. But because of the way we fund this podcast, because it is crowdfunded, there is no one sponsor that can pull out the rug if I say something that they don't like. This is why this business model is so important. So if you do support the show and if you want me to tell you the truth as I know it about whatever I find in these bills, I really need your support now, especially if you haven't been supporting the show up until now. It's really important. This is when our independence, this is when it's most important. This is when it's the scariest and when it's the most important. So please support the show. And someone who has been supporting the show, I really want to thank Tariq Leu. And I'm sorry, I should have checked how to pronounce your name before I went on the air. You actually have racked up 2 executive producer credits, and you want to put one of them on the last episode, the Federal Reserve Digital Dollar episode. And you sent in a message that said, quote, "It was really informative, and I love that you are bringing us more of the important under-the-radar things Congress is doing. Thanks for your hard work. Best, Tariq Leu." And I think the episode I just did is a perfect example of that, too. I am constantly looking for the things they are talking about while no one else is watching. And this was such a perfect example. I mean, while I was playing you all these sound clips today of that Philip Zelikow guy, I was watching the videos of them. I wasn't just listening to the audio this time. There's no one in the room. There's no one in the room. They are having these conversations as if no one's watching. And you know what? No one is. Except for us, which wouldn't be possible without you. So yeah, thank you. Thank you to everyone who participates in this. And as for the rest of November, so the government funding has to be done by November 17th. That's a Friday. And I don't think that we're going to see any war funding before November 17th. I also see signs that this new Speaker of the House, I had some thoughts about him. If you want to know the details of that, I talked about it on the November 2nd episode of We're Not Wrong. I don't trust this new speaker as far as I can throw him. I think the Democrats are going to rue the day they voted to get rid of Kevin McCarthy. Mike Johnson is much worse, and I think there's a very good chance we are headed for a shutdown this time. But I think any war funding, whatever happens on November 17th or whatever bill reopens the government, I think that's where it's going to become law. I think we're going to dingleberry the war funding. And that means that I would have to force my team to work over the Thanksgiving holiday. I would have to work nonstop over the Thanksgiving holiday to get that out by the end of November. And I don't know how long that bill's going to be. I don't know how much is going to be attached to it. Like, is it just going to be a simple CR with war funding attached to it? Or are we going to get a couple different funding bills? Like, I have absolutely no idea how to gauge how much work is coming. So I have no idea how to approach my job this next month or two. So the next episode might actually be kind of fluffy, because one thing that I really want to do is I want to read the indictment of George Santos. He's I mean, if you don't know who George Santos is, first of all, we just need to mark the fact that this guy got into Congress and remains in Congress. But yeah, he basically faked his identity and won an election. And he's been indicted on all kinds of stuff. And I don't know the details of that. So I'm kind of thinking, just to lighten shit up for the holidays, I might give you the details of the George Santos indictment, because right now there is an ethics committee investigation. It should be done in the next 2 weeks. And that could lead to him being expelled from Congress. So I'm interested in doing that work. And then we also, Santos is a Republican. We also have a Democratic senator who did some pretty crazy stuff. Bob Menendez, he's been a feature on this show quite a few times. Total warmonger. He's kind of a foreign agent for Egypt. So I'm thinking about doing that episode over the next 2 weeks. And then I will get to the government funding / war money when it happens. But right now, everything in this Congress is so unpredictable. And, I said it. You heard me on so many episodes. The minute this Congress got elected, I said, this is going to be the worst Congress ever. And I always know that the fall is the worst time. But now that we're in it, oh my God. It's beyond anything I ever imagined. So, yeah, I think I will have something for you, but it might take a minute to get you that war money episode. So like I said in the beginning of this, I appreciate your patience. I will have answers for you when I have them. But right now, I'm just watching the news just like everybody else. So, yeah. But if you're the praying type, let's pray for everyone in Palestine and Israel. I mean, they still lost 1,400 people. And all of these reports of anti-Semitism, I mean, Israel and Jewish people are not the same thing. In fact, some of the most beautiful protests that I have seen in our country have been put together by Jewish people. So, what we're seeing the government do, we should not be equating, the religion and the government. They are not the same. Oh, it's all so awful. So obviously, I'm not in a good headspace. But I hope you guys are. And yeah, let's just hope for peace in this crazy world. I'm waiting for good news. So let's hope that good news is around the corner, because it can't keep like this, right? It just can't. All right. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite of any in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is all right. In the end, they'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.